Hey everybody. All right, so we're going to get started. We're going to be making a German rye bread. That's actually a relatively light rye bread. It's not really heavy. It's not a super dark rye bread. It's a traditional German Bauerbrot, which is a farmer's bread. And this is a bread they've made for centuries over there. Um, the farmers would make it. It's a nice hearty bread, great for cold weather, kind of like what we have this weekend. So hopefully we'll get started on this. And it's pretty easy. You don't need a lot of ingredients. You don't need a lot of instruments and tools. It's kind of foolproof, but we'll see how that goes. But it's kind of fun too. There's a pre-ferment stage that we're going to make. We'll be mixing that up this morning. And this is what I want you guys to do on Sunday morning before we actually go live later on at 1 o'clock. So ideally you can do this in the morning. If you can't do it in the morning, you can do it in the evening and then let it sit overnight in your refrigerator. The pre-ferment stage, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, should be about 3 to 5 hours in order to really develop really good flavor. And you'll see kind of how this is going to work. Okay, for this, as always, with any kind of baking, I like to make sure that we weigh all our ingredients, that we're not doing it by volume, other than small things like salt and stuff that really doesn't add that much volume-wise. But we're going to be doing everything by weight. What you really want to do is you want to have a nice big bowl. And I like a glass bowl just so you can see what's happening as this process evolves. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating first a starter. And I've given you all the ingredients, but we'll go ahead and mix those up. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my bowl on my scale and zero it. And then in here, we're going to add 100 grams of our bread flour. And again, we talked about this last time. We want to use a bread flour, not a low protein flour that's like an all-purpose flour. I like the King Arthur flour just because it has one of the highest protein ratings and gives you really good gluten structure. So we're going to do 100 grams of this. We'll mix that in. There's 100. Oop, almost. There's 100. And then we're going to do our rye flour. And I send everybody the rye flour. If you don't have it, it's available at most stores. You might have to shop around a little bit. One of the things I do want to mention with the rye flour is after you open it, it's really good to keep the rye flour in your refrigerator or in the freezer because it does spoil faster than regular flour. So we're going to do 100 grams of this. Hopefully everybody can see that. There's 200. So we're right at the point where we want to be. And then in our starter, and again, I got my little cheat sheet here. We've got half a teaspoon of active yeast or instant yeast. And I like instant yeast for this. So we're going to mix the dry ingredients all first. So I'm going to get my half a teaspoon. And this is the instant yeast that I'm using. I keep this in the refrigerator also when I'm not using it. And then we do want to mix this up a little bit. So I'm going to grab a fork over here real quick and just kind of mix all this up really nicely. Just to kind of get all the flours blended and the yeast blended before we add any of the liquid ingredients. Okay, so that's our dry. So we're going to set that aside just for a second. And on the 0 here again. And then I just take a different container for this. You can probably do it all in the big container, but if you screw it up, then you got to start all over again. Whereas if you do it separately, all you're doing is throwing away some water. So I've got some warm water here, and I like this to be about 100 degrees, maybe at 102 to 4 at the most. You want it to be warm to the touch, and you can put it in your microwave and warm it up. You can get hot water out of the tap. I don't like using tap water because it has a lot of chlorine in it, and so I use either bottled water or filtered water for all my bread making. So on our recipe, I think it calls for 340 grams. Let's check that. So 340 grams of warm water. So we'll add that here. There's 342. It's a little bit over. We'll take just a little bit out. There's 340. Okay. And then, and I do, by the way, I do use a digital thermometer, and I checked that it was about 100 degrees when I put it in. You don't have to. You can just do it by, warm to the touch kind of thing too. And then the next thing it calls for is our carbohydrate, and we're adding a carbohydrate. I mean, of course the flour is a carbohydrate, but if you add a simple sugar, and I really like for this the malt extract that we used before. If you don't have this, you can get by with dark Caro syrup or honey, but the darker the product, the richer, the darker the dough is going to end up being, and it just adds, kind of a good look to it. Plus the flavor I really like from the malt extract. But if you don't have it, no big deal. So this requires 60 grams or 3 tablespoons of honey or malt syrup, and I've actually got some here that I've actually warmed up a little bit to try and make it a little bit more pliable. And we're going to 0 this again. And we're going to put 60 grams of this into our bin. There's 30. There's 50. And again, probably doesn't need to be exact, but this is going to really activate the yeast when we get it mixed in there. It's easy for the yeast to digest and really start going to town on. Plus it adds a little dark color, and it adds a nice little flavor. All right, so that should be about 60. There we go, that's close enough. This stuff is messy, so I'm just going to rinse my fingers real quick. All right, and what I do with this, I want to really mix in that syrup or the honey or the malt extract that we put in there, just to really get it kind of suspended well in the water before we mix it into our flour. So just kind of mix it in pretty well. All right, and I'm actually going to use my fingertip to kind of really get it in there because it sticks to the bottom. And this way it all transfers nicely when you get it over there. All right, So that should be all of our starter ingredients. And what we're going to do now is just mix these together. So I'm going to pour this in. You'll see that there's some stuff that's kind of stuck on there. So I'm just going to use my finger to really suspend that all, get it all in there. All right. And then I'm going to use my fork just to really mix all these ingredients together, get all that flour mixed into the water, break up all these little clumps that are in there. And it just takes a few minutes to do this. Try not to get it too much up the sides. Just kind of keep it stirring in between there. Go around a few times. If you use the active yeast instead of using the instant yeast, some people recommend that you take a little bit of that active yeast and instead of putting it in the flour like I did, mix it in with the water before you pour it into the flour, just to really activate that yeast, and just give it a couple minutes sitting there to activate that dry active yeast. The instant yeast you can just put straight in like I did. It probably doesn't make too much difference when we're using a pre-starter like this. All right, so that's all pretty nicely suspended. It looks reasonably smooth in there, not a lot of big clumps anymore. So now we can just let that sit. So I'm going to set this aside and mix up our other flour. Okay, for this next part, we're going to be mixing in making the bread flour mix. And this mix is actually going to be layered on top of the starter that we've got here, okay? And you'll see kind of how that's all going to work. So for this, again, take a little different bowl. We're going to zero it out, and then it calls for 375 grams, again, of bread flour. And if you want to add a little whole wheat, you can. But we're going to stick with 375, which is of just the bread flour. Oops, that's 280. Okay, 375 I said. Now I didn't do the math on this, but it's probably about I bet you 60% hydration bread. And if you remember, that's how much flour there is to water. Okay, so that's 375. And then to this, traditionally we use caraway seeds, okay? So we're going to do 2 tablespoons of caraway seeds. And someone asked to use the whole caraway seeds. Yes, use the whole caraway seeds. And this is, again, the German tradition. This really adds, makes the flavor, you know, what you would expect for this bread. Doesn't have to be exact, but about 2 tablespoons is the traditional recipe. Now I just happen to have some extra flaxseed that I use for a lot of my other baking, and I'm gonna add just a little bit of that just because it adds a little bit of, if you can get into it, it adds just a little bit of extra body. You don't have to do that. And if I actually I ordered some black sesame seeds for something that I was baking once, and I didn't realize that I got, like, 2 pounds of it. So I'm just going to add a little bit of these just to try and use them up a little bit. And we'll throw some of those in there too. All right. And then the recipe says 1.5 teaspoons, 1.5 teaspoons of sea salt. And again, we want to use sea salt or kosher salt. Either one's going to be fine. You don't want to use table salt, which has iodine in it. It adds a weird flavor. So again, 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Let's go with a half. Maybe a little bit more than I needed. All right. And then, again, another half teaspoon of yeast. I always tend to forget this other half teaspoon of yeast, but this, you know, the whole dough has basically a teaspoon of yeast in it. The first teaspoon's in there, first half a teaspoon's in there. Second half is going to be in the dry component here. All right, so we're again going to take a fork and just mix up all this dry ingredient. You want to suspend all those seeds and stuff in there as best you can. You want to mix the yeast together. And that's pretty much it. All right. So now what we're going to do is hopefully we've got the yeast going and it's starting to activate in there. Hopefully it's good yeast. And now what we're going to do is layer the dry on top of this starter. So I'm just going to take this and kind of put it out, not mixing it in. I'm just going to be kind of moving it around. We're just going to be layering this right on top. Try not to spill it out the side like I just did. Okay. Just spread it around a bit, layering it right on top like that. All right, then just kind of spread it out, make it nice and even over the top. We're not mixing it into the bottom layer. We're just putting it right on top like this. Doesn't have to be perfect. Something like that's going to work. All right. And then we're just going to let this sit. I'm going to get a little piece of plastic wrap and we'll cover this up. So I'm going to take my plastic wrap and put it over the top so that it does not dry out. All right, just like that. And now we're going to let this sit until we go live at 1 o'clock. So this is, if you can look from the side here now, you can see I got the wet starter dough on the bottom, we got the dry on top, and what's going to happen is as this wet dough on the bottom starts fermenting, it's going to start eating into this dry dough on top, and it continuously feeds that yeast and it incorporates it over time, and it's a very kind of slow fermentation process. You can get by with just an hour, but you get much better flavor if you can go 3, 4, 5 hours. So that's the reason I wanted to try and start this early in the morning on Sunday, and then just let it sit out on the counter, room temperature. You don't need to do anything with it. You can periodically look and see if the fermentation process is going the way it should. But then hopefully by the time we get to 1 o'clock, it's going to be starting to really eat into this upper layer nicely, and then we're going to mix our dough, and we'll do that live just to kind of make sure that we don't screw that part up. This part is just mixing and layering. It's pretty straightforward. I don't think you need my instruction for that. I just wanted to kind of show you exactly kind of how we're going to do this. Now, if you, like I said, if you want to and you can't do it Sunday morning, you can start this process and do this Saturday night. Leave it out on the counter for an hour or 2 hours to get the fermentation process started. Then stick it in your fridge, and then late in the morning on Sunday, 10 o'clock or something like that, 9, 10 o'clock, you can take it out and put it back on the counter, and the process will kind of continue. I've actually never done that, but it should ought to work. So if you're pressed for time on Sunday morning and you can't do this, then that's the alternative. Other than that, we'll see you 1 o'clock. I'll send everybody the link. It'll hopefully be a Zoom call. I still haven't decided if we're just going to do the one Zoom call, mixing everything together and shaping the loaves. There is a rise process that has to occur before we can start baking. And there is a final shaping that I'd actually maybe like to do a 15-minute follow-up, but you guys can let me know if you want to do that live or if you want to just have me do that as a separate YouTube video, just to kind of show you how that's done. All right, see you Sunday. Okay, so actually I decided to do the overnight method and put this in, left it out on the counter for about 2 hours after just topping it off like we talked about yesterday. Put it in the refrigerator overnight, and now it's been out on the counter here for about 2 hours again, just getting back up to room temperature. You can see how that bottom layer has started really eating into the top dough. You can see it bubbling through the surface here. So we're going to go ahead and take it out and form our dough. Okay, so here we are. You can see it really kind of bubbling through. That's really great. That usually means that our yeast was good. All right, so we're going to add our tablespoon of our oil. And just sprinkle this in. And then it says take a wooden spoon, and we talked a little bit about spoons last time. I mentioned that, I thought for the sourdough that the concern with using a metal spoon was that a lot of metal spoons back in the old days were made out of silver, and the silver would potentially kill the bacteria. But a friend of mine pointed out that a lot of those recipes are old recipes going back, years and years and years and centuries maybe even. And the big thing was that the wooden spoons were just bigger. And that probably is the real reason. So in either case, we're going to mix all this dough together. Oh, it really smells pretty good. You can smell that rye kind of odor here. Definitely doing good. So we're going to get this all just incorporated like this. And what I'm trying to do is just mix those two layers together and get all the dry part incorporated before I take it out of the bowl. And then we'll see how sticky it is. Looks pretty good. So if you notice too, while I'm doing this, I've got a flour board. This one actually is from my mother. She had it made for me years ago. My grandmother had one. I don't know that this is the original one that my grandmother had. I think this is a redo. But you don't need a flour board for this. I just happen to have this out because I was actually rolling dough to make empanadas, and I made these empanadas earlier. So That's the reason I have the board out, and I'm just going to use the board anyway since I have it out, but you can use just the countertop for this. In fact, usually if I'm just making this bread, I don't take the time to get the board out. I just usually go ahead and
Call from 5204
spam callers.
1688.
All right, so that's pretty well incorporated. And you can see how it's starting to really stick together nicely. So I'm just going to get all this off my wooden spoon. And then we'll turn it out onto our board. Don't want to waste any. All right. So let's just take a little bit of flour, and we're just going to flour our surface. And again, you can just use the countertop, but since I got the board out, I'm going to use the board. Oh, we got a little bit left down here, and I'm going to get all this out. And we'll just incorporate that all in here. Okay. So now you can see this is the dough. It's really kind of sort of dry, but rye especially is really sticky. So you want to really keep your work surface kind of floured. And as you do this, so we're just going to flatten it out a little bit and roll it over and start kneading it. And the way you knead it is to push it and then pull it back. Push it and then pull it back. Push it, then pull it back. And if it starts sticking to the board a lot or to your work surface, get a little bit more flour and just put a little bit more down. So we're just going to do this for about 5, 6, 7, 10 minutes or so. They say 10 minutes. I don't know that I've ever done 10 minutes total. Basically, I'm going to keep doing this until it doesn't stick to this board much anymore. You can see it's really kind of sticking in here still. I want it to not stick anymore to the board. And it's just, when we're doing this, by putting a little bit of flour down, it's actually absorbing this last little bit of flour and drying the dough just a little bit, getting rid of all the stickiness. But you can see it's already starting to get smoother just from doing these folds and kneads. You can see how it's not sticking much anymore to the board. So that means I've got it about right. I don't want to super dry out the dough. I don't want to make this dough too tough. But if, unlike the sourdough, the crumb, and that's the part inside the bread, on this dough, on this bread, is going to be a little denser. And on the sourdough, we want a big, open, airy spots and stuff in order to really get flavor. In here, we want a nice sandwich bread. We want a denser bread. So the crumb's going to be a little bit denser. It's going to be a little tighter. It won't have those big holes in it that we did before for the sourdough. All right, so once we get it kind of reasonably even so that there's no, big hard spots in it, and kind of looks like this. I'm losing some of my seeds. I remember I put those extra seeds and you can see them kind of falling out of the dough here. Then we're going to just let this rest. And you can rest it a couple of different ways. The best way to do this is to just put it down on your work surface and then cover it with a piece of plastic. Or you can take your bowl that you had before and cover it over and just let it rest. We're going to let it just rest for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, so here we are after about 10 minutes. I did clean the bowl in the meantime too, by the way. So This is what our dough looks like. You can see it's a little stickier now, so we're going to put a little bit more flour down. And do that same process again, okay? So we're just going to kind of pat it all down. But it's coming together really nicely now. Just kind of pat it down like that, and then we're going to do little folds and just roll it around, bringing those edges together. Kind of just kneading it. And this is building gluten structure, making the dough a little bit stronger so that it can stand on its own, because we're not going to put this in a form to form the bread. We're going to do this freestanding later on. So we're not going to put it in a baton or any of that kind of stuff. This is just a freestanding dough, very simple. So we're just going to kind of work around it here a little bit. And so kneading gets the dough nice and even, but it also starts layering the gluten fibers in there so that it starts, being able to stand on its own here a little bit. So the next stage after this, we're going to put it back in our bowl, and then we're going to let it rise. And the rising time is really going to depend upon the ambient temperature, which is temperature in the house. And right now, I can't remember what our temperature is set to. It's probably about 70. So if you do this in the summertime and it's warmer, it's going to rise a little bit faster. In the wintertime, when it's cooler, if it's cooler in your house, it's going to take a little bit longer to do an initial rise. So the initial rise is usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So once we kind of finish this kneading part, we're going to put it back in our bowl and let it rise. I'm going to probably go about 2 hours and see. You want it to about double in size. All right. So that's pretty good there. So I think my dough is looking pretty good at this point. It's not sticking to my board anymore. It's got nice body to it. So we're going to form it into a little ball, and we're just going to kind of go around and shape it into a little ball. And I basically just squeeze on the bottom as I'm doing this here to tighten it up. And this creates a nice tight skin over the surface. So as we do this, we're kind of pulling around the edges, pulling down and squeezing in on the bottom, and that tightens that surface. Okay. Then what we're going to do is oil our bowl a little bit. I'm going to do that over here. So just put a little bit of the vegetable oil in. I'm using canola oil. Last time I did this, I used grapeseed oil. So it's whatever oil that you have. Don't use olive oil. It adds a weird flavor. Great for a lot of other breads, but not necessarily for this kind of bread. So let's just stick with this. So lightly oil this. And then we're actually going to take some of this and put it on our bread. So we're going to just oil the surface of our bread a little bit. And this helps keep the moisture in so that it doesn't dry out. And of course, so it doesn't stick. So I'm just kind of working that all the way around my dough, including on the bottom a little bit. Okay, so there's our nice little dough ball. We're going to plop it in here, and then we're going to cover this with a little bit of saran wrap, or Glad wrap as it may be. And again, you got to make sure it's covered so that it doesn't dry out. All right, so This is good. And then we're gonna let it just sit here on the countertop for about 2 hours. You don't need to go put it in any special warming drawer or anything like that. You can just let it out sit and it should ought to work. Alexa, start 2-hour timer.
2 hours, starting now.
All right, we'll come back in 2 hours. Okay, so Alexa, stop. So now you can see that the dough here has risen. It is actually touching the top of the plastic. So it's about doubled in size. And this is kind of where we're gonna start our next step. It's been 2 hours. You know, I looked at this at about 1.5 hours, and I probably could have, at 1.5 hours, done this next step. But I was actually busy doing something else. And this dough is pretty forgiving, so we can let it go a little bit. So now I'm just gonna take a little flour on my work surface, and we're gonna punch down this dough, okay? So we've let it do this bulk fermentation, and I just gotta get it out here. And this is pretty quick. We're just gonna handle it really gently for a minute, and then we're gonna knock it all down. So we're gonna take out our dough, gonna lay it down on our little lightly floured work surface, and just gonna keep a little flour kind of on my hands here, just a little bit, and just gonna punch it down. All right, so we're not gonna manhandle it. We're gonna do a couple little folds, because we don't wanna get all of the air out, but we do want to get all the big airs out. And so what I'm doing now is that this is the floured side back here. All right, sorry about that. My battery died. I had to change batteries. So this is the lightly floured side, and this side is sticky. So we want to actually fold everything in towards this sticky side. And we're just going to be stretching and folding it in, stretching and folding it in, stretching, folding it in, stretching, and folding it in. And we basically created a new little ball. And again, I'm just going to take all my edges and kind of just squeeze them together along the bottom here. I kind of just push my finger up from the bottom. So I don't know if you can see that. This is basically what I'm doing. I'm trying to get all these little rough edges all together. So pull it all together. And what we're doing by doing this is creating a tight skin on that surface again, just like we did before, okay? So this side is getting nice and tight. And that's what we're trying to do, is just create that tight skin on the surface. Looks like a little mushroom now, see? All right. So this is the next step, and we're gonna drop that back in our bowl. It looks like we just defeated all what we just did, but we're creating tension and we're creating little air spaces in here. We're getting rid of the big ones. That's what we just did. We're gonna put it back in here, we're gonna cover it, and we're gonna give this about 45 minutes or so. All right, so Alexa, start 45-minute timer. And what I do at this point also is go ahead and get my oven ready. So I'm gonna put my oven up here. I think we're 450. Let's start with that. We'll check that temperature later on. And gotta change my racks around here. I actually baked some stuff earlier, so I gotta get all this out. And since I'm gonna be making this inside of my Dutch oven, I'm gonna move my racks down so that I have clearance for my Dutch oven. Okay. Now, I'll be putting the Dutch oven with the bread on and right on there, right on top. If you are going to use just the wire racks and a baking sheet, or put your bread right on the stone, which you absolutely can do, what you want to do also then is put some kind of a pan underneath, and you can use any kind of pan that you have, and just slide it in underneath. This one doesn't quite fit. I'd have to get a little different pan. Well, actually it will. And you're going to put that underneath. And what we're going to do later on is pour water in here very carefully, and we'll talk about that, in order to create steam. So if you do the Dutch oven, you don't need to do this step. But if you don't have a Dutch oven and you're just going to do it on the wire rack on a baking sheet or directly on your stone, you got to create steam in order to really get this bread to rise. So then you need to put this pan underneath, preheat it. Don't use glass, because as you pour your water in, it could crack the glass. Try and use some kind of a metal pan or a cast iron pan. I've got a cast iron frying pan that I use for this, and that works very well. So anyway, that's just getting your oven set up. Actually, I'm going to go to 475 to start with. So we'll check the temperature in the recipe. So I'm just going to get the oven going, preheated, so it's all ready for later on. Okay, so for this next bit, we're going to be taking our dough, doing one more final manipulation to get the surface tension really good so it can stand alone. But I'm going to show you a little trick, because I'm going to be using the cast iron pot to help bake this. So I'm going to want to lower that down into the pot safely. So if you take a piece of parchment paper and just cut the corners off, kind of like this. This will help us, and you'll see, transfer our dough later on. Okay. So we're just going to have that ready here. And I got my water boiling. And you'll see what that's for in just a minute. All right, so we're going to take our dough out. Again. Kind of got that sticky side there, so we're going to lay us down. I got my lightly floured surface. And I'm just going to, again, push it down just a little bit, just like we did before. And again, I'm going to pull those edges up, right? We're going to just pull them up like this again, just like we did last time. Again, we're creating that surface tension. Okay, and then we're just going to kind of stitch all this together. Making that nice and tight. Okay, so we're just going to do it like this. Now if you want, you can also manipulate this. Some people will actually take a bench knife, and let's get rid of a lot of this flour here now, in order to kind of create that surface tension better on there and finish off the bottom. If you get this all just nice and cleaned off, you can then just kind of drag it with your hands kind of toward you, and it tightens up this little ball. Or you can cheat by using this little bench knife to kind of push underneath it. So the movement is kind of grabbing it, pulling it towards you, kind of like this, and just kind of keep turning it. And if you notice, as I'm doing this, it's kind of pulling in on the upper side, creating more and more tension on the surface. And that's really what we want to do. We want to kind of create that tension on the surface. So again, I'm just dragging it towards me, turning it, dragging it towards me, turning it, dragging it towards me, turning it. like this. Making a really nice, tight ball. All right. And that's just really tightening up the ball underneath. I like that. Okay. So from the side, you can see how it's nice and rounded all the way around, right? Sitting up nicely on its own. So that's pretty darn good. Maybe just a little bit more. Okay. So now, because it is kind of cold in the house, it is the winter time. Maybe in the summer I wouldn't do this next step, but what you want to do now is one of two things. You can either cover this back with your bowl, and in order to keep it, you know, to allow it to do the final rise, because we're in our final rise stage. You can wrap it just with some plastic wrap, okay, but oil it a little bit first if you do, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually transfer this to this little piece of parchment paper. And I'm going to take a little bit of, where did my cornmeal go? Here. I'm going to take a little bit of my cornmeal and just sprinkle this down. You don't need a lot. Sprinkle this down on your surface. And this will just help prevent it from sticking later on when we try and take it out. It also creates a nice bottom on our bread. So again, just a little bit more tightening. Keep that nice and tight. Just nice and tight. All right. And then we're gonna just transfer it here, okay? Put this out of the way. And I'm just gonna slide this over. Okay. And then I'm going to cover it, instead of using my bowl, I'm going to cover it just with this big box, this old shoebox. And I had this before when we did our sourdough breads. So I'm going to come over here again, grab a cup of hot water. Okay, and I'm going to put my hot water in underneath here. And that's going to create humidity in here. It's also going to warm this just a little bit to allow this final rise to really be good. Okay, so this is pretty much how I like to set it up if I'm going to be baking in the Dutch oven in the cast iron. If you're not going to do this, again, you can do it this way, which is fine, or you can just use your bowl, cover it up, or you can cover it with plastic wrap to do this final rise. This final rise is, again, about 45 minutes to an hour. You have to just kind of watch your dough. We've created a lot of good surface tension on there. Hopefully that's going to really help make our bread stand up and be good when we bake it. So again, come back here in about 45 minutes, an hour, see what it looks like. I have since also put my Dutch oven into the oven, which I preheated before. So now the Dutch oven is preheating. And we're all set. We just have to wait another hour. All right, Alexa, stop timer. All right, so it's been about 45 minutes or so since I put this together. So we're going to take this off and see what it looks like. Ooh, that smells good. And we got a really nice loaf standing up really nice. I really like the way that looks, so hopefully that's going to work out fine for us. So now we need to figure out how are we going to transfer this into the oven, or how are we going to transfer this into our Dutch oven or a cast iron pot. So I'm going to move this a little bit closer over here. And in order to move the dough, you can either slide a sheet pan underneath to parchment. That's the reason I like the parchment paper. I'm just going to use a pizza peel just because you all know I like to make pizzas. And we're just going to move this over here now. Just getting it closer to my area where I'm going to work with the hot Dutch oven. Now I'm going to get the Dutch oven out of the big oven. Get my gloves on. Get this out. And I'm just going to put this right here near where the bread is. Shut the door. Okay. So we're pretty close to ready to go. I'm going to move this handle this way a little bit. So we just need to do a couple things before we really do anything more. One of which is I like to score it and then dust it, or dust it and then score it. So this is really just more cosmetic than anything else. I'm just going to take a little bit of flour and just sprinkle it on top here. And this is really just more for coloration later on than anything else. You can use any flour. This happens to be rice flour that I'm using. So we're just going to sprinkle that on. Just kind of gently, gently, gently lay it on. Okay. Then we're going to make our score marks. And in order to do this, I usually make 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So kind of like you're playing tic-tac-toe. And I'm using a straight razor, cutting about 1/4 of an inch deep. And you can see how that surface tension is perfect because we're getting really nice separation of our dough. All right, now we got to drop it in here quickly. This part you got to move along here. You don't want to dilly-dally too much. So this is really hot. You got to put your gloves back on. All right, and then this is why I put these little handles on here, so I can lift and safely drop this in without me touching it. And then what I'm gonna do is just take some water, and you can, I'm just gonna spray this on. It adds a little steam. You can either spray it on, you can drizzle it on, you can sprinkle it on, you can do any way to get it on there. But now you want to get this in the oven quickly, okay? So now we're gonna move it over here. Actually, I gotta open the oven. And slide this in the oven. And I got my oven at 450. So we're gonna start there, and we're gonna bake this for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take the lid off. Alexa, start 15-minute bake timer.
Bake timer, 15 minutes, starting now.
Okay, so it's been 15 minutes, and we've been cooking or baking with our lid on. And first thing I'm going to do, because I always forget, I'm going to reduce my temperature down to about 400 degrees. Maybe a smidge, well, 400 degrees. All right. My oven tends to be a little hot. So let's see how we're doing. I'm going to pull this out. We're going to take the lid off. Whoa. So it really exploded. I probably didn't do my my folds, my second proofing enough, but in either case, it really exploded, or I didn't score it deep enough. In either case, let's see what this looks like. We're gonna go ahead and finish baking it up. Alexa, start 25-minute timer. Alexa, start 25-minute timer.
25 minutes, starting now.
All right, so I turned my temperature down, took my lid off. We're gonna bake it for another 20-25 minutes. We'll see kind of what it looks like. We wanna get to an internal temperature of 190. So the loaf really overproofed, I guess. Well, actually, no, it didn't overproof. It would have collapsed. So it really just super expanded, had too much air in it. I probably needed to make deeper score marks in there. Or when we did our second fold, and I probably needed to really pat it down a little bit more to get some of the air out. I was too gentle with it. So next time I'd be a little bit more aggressive with that first folding where we took it out. It had doubled in size, and then we kind of patted it down. I think I would be a little bit more aggressive with that, or maybe not put it in the hot box. Maybe the hot box was a little bit too much and it rose too much. So that was, when we put it in here, that maybe caused that to occur. So these things do happen. We'll see how it turns out. It's going to taste great. It smells just wonderful. But again, I haven't done this overnight proofing process or fermentation process, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so it's been about 25 minutes. We're gonna probably end up taking our bread out, but just gonna check internal temperature on the bread real quick. First, let's pull this out. Oh, it looks really good. We're gonna check and just wanna make sure this is 190 at least. And it's gonna be easy 190. Okay. So 191. So we're going to take our bread out here. And, wow, that thing just really expanded. All right. So I probably could have baked it just a few minutes less, but it's better to be a few minutes less than a few minutes more. Excuse me, a few minutes more than a few minutes less. You don't want it doughy in the middle. So you can see there were some big air spaces here, and that's the reason that it really overexpanded, and that's because when we were doing our patting it down and doing those initial folds, we didn't get all the air out. So I probably need to be more aggressive with that next time, but it's still going to be just fantastic. So just really carefully now I can just lift this out. And I'm going to set it over here on a little wire rack. Oh, that's just spectacular. I really haven't had one expand quite as much. You can see all the gluten fibers here just really super stretched. And again, I don't know if this is because I did the overnight thing in the oven. I've not had one expand this much. It looks fantastic though. So you can see the outside here is nice and firm. Wow, we got a really good crust. We're gonna let it cool before we open it up and see what the crumb and stuff looks like inside, but wow, pretty spectacular. Let's see how this looks inside later. Wow, just perfect. Smells great too.